Greetings from the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. I am Stephen Fenberg, and I am delighted to be here to talk about my dear friend Audrey Jones Beck, her husband John, and the magnificent John A. and Audrey Jones Beck collection at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston in Texas. I'm standing next to Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait as a painter, which he painted in 1887, 1888, right around the same time he painted The Rocks, which is in the Beck collection in Houston, Texas. The Becks began their collection in 1963. They bought The Rocks in 1964. It was one of 8 paintings they bought that year. Well, here is how it all started. In the 1880s, Martin Tilford Jones, Audrey Jones Beck's great-grandfather, bought 6,000 acres along Buffalo Bayou. It was just a small part of his vast lumber empire, which spread across East Texas and Louisiana. The land transferred generation by generation, finally to Audrey, and when she inherited it, it was surrounded by the port of Houston. She sold the acreage off piece by piece to acquire the paintings that now grace the walls of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston today. Martin Tilford Jones and his wife Louisa were the first of the Jones family to come to Texas. They arrived in Houston when only 25,000 people lived there, but they understood they would prosper only if their community thrived, so they simultaneously built their business and their community. For example, they were founding members of St. Paul's United Methodist Church, which coincidentally is now across the street from the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and the Audrey Jones Beck building. There's a plaque in the sanctuary lobby that says Louisa Jones donated the bells in the tower in memory of Martin Tilford Jones and to the glory of God. Their nephew, Jesse Jones, followed them to Houston, and he became the city's preeminent developer during the first half of the 20th century. He built the city's tallest office towers, its most ornate movie theaters, and its most lavish hotels. He also built his community. He raised Houston's half of the funds to build the Houston Ship Channel, and along with his wife, Mary Gibbs Jones, they were among the leading philanthropists during that time. They nurtured every fledgling institution in the city, including the Museum of Fine Arts Houston since its inception in 1924 and beyond. They also established Houston Endowment, a philanthropic foundation that to this day improves life for the people of Houston in a meaningful and substantial way. I mentioned Jesse and Mary because Audrey had a very complicated ancestry. She said she had 2 sets of parents, her own and her grandparents, Jesse and Mary. She lived with them more and spent more time with them than she did with her own parents. And they influenced her life in profound ways. Audrey would recall walking down bustling Main Street with her grandfather, and everybody knew him. He was so recognized. He was called Mr. Houston. He would tip his hat as they walked by. But what impressed her most is her grandfather knew the names of the street merchants, the panhandlers, and their dogs' names too. And she embraced that openness and acceptance of everyone, and it was apparent throughout her life. Audrey attended the Kincaid School in Houston, and at age 16, after school let out for the summer, she and a group of friends went to England and France with chaperones. Of course, her grandparents, Jesse and Mary, kind of followed close behind to make sure their granddaughter would stay safe. The trip for Audrey was pivotal. Here is what she wrote in a Beck collection catalog, and I quote, "I paid homage to the Mona Lisa and the Venus de Milo, but the imaginative and colorful Impressionist paintings came as a total surprise. Works by these avant-garde artists who had rebelled against the academic tradition of the day were scarce in American museums at the time. For me, they were not only the epitome of artistic freedom, but also a visual delight. I returned home with many pictures, but none taken with my camera. My images were museum reproductions." I'm sure she couldn't imagine then one day she would have the real things on her walls at home. After high school, Audrey went to Mount Vernon College in Washington, D.C. to be close to her grandparents. And on occasion, she went to the White House to see the Roosevelts with them. Some years later, she transferred to the University of Texas at Austin, and one evening she went to the opening of the Officers Club at the Corpus Christi Naval Air Station. And there she met this handsome young pilot named John Beck, who was from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They fell in love, and within a year, they were married. When John was released from service, the couple made their home in Houston. John developed Beck Engineering to sell and lease heavy equipment, which his family had done in Wisconsin, and Audrey embraced the visual and performing arts. Her grandmother, Mary Gibbs Jones, was a trustee of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in the late 1920s and was an original trustee of the Houston Symphony Society in 1913. Audrey, as always, followed suit. In the mid-1950s, she became a founding trustee of the Houston Ballet, the Houston Grand Opera, and was also a trustee of the Houston Symphony Society. By then, the Becks were becoming an enormously popular and visible couple. They had a gorgeous house on Inwood Drive in River Oaks, and it was a little different than the other houses in the neighborhood. Next to them, the lawns were very heavily manicured, but their yard was forested and almost wild, which obscured their house from the street, but also reflected their love of the natural world. Their home was really becoming a hub for important events and glamorous parties. And auction houses and galleries back then would bring paintings to Houston and show them in anticipation of their upcoming sales. Well, they all clamored to show their paintings in the Beck's home, which was right up Audrey's alley. So these paintings would come in, and Audrey would take pictures of them with her Brownie camera, and she'd write notes about them on the back of each picture. And she realized every time the paintings came into their house, they were becoming more and more expensive, and they always sold for much more than they had been originally advertised. She kidded John one time and said she could do better buying and selling paintings than he could do in the stock market. But financial gain was not her inspiration. She fell in love again with these gorgeous paintings that had captivated her as a teenager. By 1963, the Becks bought their first 4 paintings for their collection. In 1964, they bought 8 more, including 2 by Pierre Bonnard and, of course, Van Gogh's The Rocks. And they weren't buying paintings willy-nilly to decorate their house. They had a very clear intention, just like the Joneses before them. They wanted to create something they could give to the community that would enrich people's lives. So they were creating what they called a student collection or a teacher collection that would show the scope of the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist period, how the artists were connected to each other, what influenced them. So they were buying paintings by well-known artists and lesser-known artists. And they loved inviting scholars and art students into their house to see their beautiful paintings. And I've heard that there could be a dozen students on the floor making sketches and vigorously discussing art amongst themselves. Wandering around their home must have been thrilling. In the living room, visitors would see paintings by Modigliani, Matisse, Duran, Van Gogh. Outside the kitchen door was Van Dogen's The Corn Poppy. Above their bed was Chagall's The Woman and the Roses. The Becks were admired front row attendees at auctions in Paris, London, and New York. And John was Audrey's advocate. In Paris, when she was set to buy Cross's The Flowered Terrace, from what I understand, John had to stand up at some point and say, "Please help us. We don't speak fluent French, and my wife really wants to buy this painting." So his request was granted, and they placed the winning bid and brought the painting back to Texas. Here's a fun fact about Audrey few people know. She was really a good painter in her own right, and on occasion, she would paint a copy of a painting she bought to get more of an idea about what the artist was thinking and doing. John would hang the paintings in his office, but they were so good, people thought they were the real thing. So they decided to keep the copies private to maintain the credibility of their collection, which was becoming renowned. They sent some of the pictures to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. for an exhibition there. And J. Carter Brown, the director, was trying to convince them to donate the entire collection to that prestigious museum in Washington. But the Becks had other ideas. They had sent the other paintings that were in the house to the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, in anticipation of the opening of the Brown Pavilion in 1974. And then tragedy struck. John Beck died suddenly at home in September 1973, and that ended Audrey's interest in having the paintings at home. She left the paintings where they were, and the ones in Washington came back to the museum. John willed his half interest in the collection to the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. The following year, Audrey became a trustee, and in 1984, she became a life trustee. The Becks bought 46 paintings between 1963 and 1973. During the next 30 years of Audrey's life, she bought 24 more masterworks, including those by Manet, Gauguin, but also lesser-known artists such as Schufenecker, Kubka, and Ephanopoul. So here's another fun story about Audrey, and I think it's safe to tell now since it's kind of, long ago. After John passed away, when Audrey would buy a painting, the museum would send it to her house for her to live with and enjoy for a few days. Well, here's the secret. On occasion, she would put one of these precious paintings in the back seat of her car and drive it over to Harris Masterson's home, Rienzi, which is now a Museum of Fine Arts Houston house museum. The two lifelong friends would set this painting up on an easel. They would sip champagne. They would talk about life and about art. And then Audrey would put the painting back in her car and drive it home and keep it for another day or so until the museum came to collect it and put it into her collection. Here's another thing about Audrey, because people asked her this all the time, myself included. Experienced and inexperienced collectors asked her for guidance. What motivates you? What guides you? And she would say consistently, buy what you love. That was her guidance. Buy what you love. Audrey only saw the last painting she bought in photographs, Ripple Ronai's interior. But it brought the collection full circle. Because in Pierre Bonnard's The Painter's Studio, he features Ripple Ronai, his dog, and his wife in their studio. And that was one of the first paintings the Becks bought in 1964. I met Audrey in 1993 after Houston Endowment hired me to pursue projects that would renew and maintain knowledge about her illustrious grandfather, Jesse Jones. During our first meeting, she was showing me some family pictures. And mind you, I had just met her, and she showed me a picture of her engagement to John. And I said, Audrey, were you two the most beautiful couple in town? And without missing a beat, she looked me square in the eye and said, no, dear, we were the most fun. And from that moment on, we became fast friends, and hardly a day passed when we didn't trade emails or have a phone conversation. And on occasion, I'd pick up star pizzas and bring them to her house for an impromptu dinner party, and she liked her pizzas as spicy as possible. I have been so honored and privileged to speak with you today about my dear friend Audrey, her husband John, and the wonderful John A. and Audrey Jones Beck collection from the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. How cool is that? Audrey and John created and provided a profound and enduring gift to the people of Houston and to art lovers everywhere. I want to offer my thanks to the Van Gogh Museum for allowing me to be here to speak with you and for connecting the community of remarkable museums for art lovers everywhere. I hope you will visit the paintings in Houston and also enjoy the upcoming catalog by Dr. Helga Arish, which is just wonderful. I've had a sneak preview of a little bit of it, And I can tell you it's entertaining, enjoyable, and so informative and wonderful to look at and see. Thank you again for allowing me to speak with you about my dear friend Audrey, John, and the Beck collection.